The approach most suitable for reaching these common goals was for many, many years trying to create a friendly environment. And on the basis of that was a common understanding that these goals can best be reached through multilateral approaches, an ideal that I would say especially the European Union strives to maintain until today. Since the election of Mr. Trump, we can observe deterioration of the transatlantic relations. I mean, when we talk about the suspension of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris climate deal, the INF, open skies, the attacks on WHO and NATO, but also more on economic terms when it comes on pressure regarding Nord Stream 2 and WTO. In times when divisions between the European Union and the US have become more visible, we will now try to discuss if the November election can change this state of affairs. And I am very happy to have here three very distinguished guests with me who will try to tackle these issues. As for the procedure, I would say that for the beginning, I would ask you a very short question, 10 minutes, but I would also like to encourage our participants to ask questions in the chat sections, and we're also live streaming this event on Facebook. Let me start with Mr. Dan Hamilton. He's the director of the Global Europe program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and he's also the Distinguished Fellow of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation and a Senior Fellow of the Johns Hopkins University. Good morning to you. It's evening here in Austria, so a very warm welcome from my side. And I would like to kick off the discussion, starting with you, asking about this before mentioned deterioration of relations between the US and Europe. Why would you say are these old friends drifting apart these days? And are the US and the Europeans still allies? And is there hope for improvement of the relations if in November there will be a change in the government in the US? Mr. Hamilton, thank you very much for joining. The floor is yours, and please.
Guten Abend. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here also with my other friends and colleagues. Let me, in this brief time, I think it's very important for our non-American friends when they're looking at the US elections, before I get to your question, just some basic fundamentals sometimes that are misunderstood about the US election. It's really important to understand that the United States is a representative democracy, not a parliamentary democracy, and that the president does not come out of the parliament. He and the vice president are elected separately, and part of the checks and balances in the US system, so that it doesn't, who's the majority in the Congress is important, but it's not related to the executive. And that's very different, obviously, than in most European countries. And because of that, the electoral system in the United States is also different, going back hundreds of years. One can criticize it, but it is what we have. So it's important to understand that the public opinion polls you might be reading in the media really don't tell you anything. I would say ignore them. They say Joe Biden's ahead, but Hillary Clinton was ahead even more 4 years ago. Really, our election is about 50 simultaneous elections, or 51, if you will, if you can count Washington, D.C., all happening at the same time in each state. And a president to win has to win the votes of that state. And that's what makes up the Electoral College. So it's really more important to look at what's happening in certain states rather than these general trends. The president and the vice president are not the only ones to be elected in November, but the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the US Senate. So the question of the majority becomes important. Most would anticipate the Democrats will retain the majority in the House, but the majority in the Senate is up for grabs. The Republicans have 4-vote lead, but in a number of states they are behind. So it could be, you could see President Trump reelected and then a Democratic Congress, which would be very problematic to get anything done. Or you could see Joe Biden elected and Democrats elected in both the Senate and the House. You'd have a complete sweep and a Democratic majority everywhere. which would be a very fundamentally different situation. So it really does matter, I think, for the U.S.-European relationship, how that turns out. The other thing to remember is that then if you want to look on the election, look to what are called the Battleground States, a few states where probably the election will be decided. Each candidate has to hold what they won 4 years ago, each party. They can't lose any states. And right now, Mr. Trump is in danger of losing the state of Arizona. And if he loses that, it'll be very hard for him to win. Because he'll have to win all of the other so-called battleground states. Those include states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. If I had to tell you one state to watch, it'll be the state of Pennsylvania. It's the home state of Joe Biden. And yet it's a very diverse state that Donald Trump carried 4 years ago. And it has enough votes to tip the tide in a close election. We will also maybe not even know the victor on our election day because of so many mail-in balloting and so many probably fights over the results of the ballot in certain states. I just want to give you that background. The point being, it'll be decisive for our relationship who really is elected and whether the Congress majorities support that executive decision or not. The U.S. could be paralyzed even if Joe Biden is elected because of differences in the Congress, and vice versa, even if President Trump is reelected. So let me give you the stark, I'll be very provocative and blunt and brief. If Donald Trump is elected, our relationship will come unhinged more than it is today, because I think it will have been a vindication of his view by the American people that the United States has gotten a raw deal from the international system, and it should no longer think of itself as the steward or supporter of that system. It should be out for itself. And that means striking different deals with all of its partners, allies, or adversaries. It doesn't really matter. I would go so far to say NATO will be hollowed out. It will really not exist in any real form because countries will no longer be count on the U.S. security guarantee. Now, some Europeans would think that's an opportunity to build a European defense, and this will be a chance for Europe to come together. I would argue the opposite. I think what you will see is a scramble by certain European capitals to Washington to get bilateral defense guarantees, with Warsaw #1 in line, and that you will see a return to the old Europe of countries looking over their shoulder at each other because they don't trust each other and trying to seek out marginal advantage with the US or with other countries. That will be a Europe that's less secure, not more secure. You will see a return to economic nationalism. The tariffs you mentioned will only get worse. And I think it's important to understand the Trump administration is not about sharing burdens. It's about shedding burdens. It's about getting rid of burdens and putting burdens on others to carry the day. And Europe will feel that most acutely in the Middle East, where the United States will simply walk away. If Joe Biden is elected, I think Europeans will tend to make two mistakes. The first will be right on election day or afterward, which everyone will breathe a big sigh of relief and say, oh, we can go back to business as usual. I think that's a big mistake. And it means there won't be much thought given to what to do with the Biden administration until the inauguration in January, which means Europe could lose 2 months of critical time to prepare for a new administration by thinking you could go back to something that existed before. There's no going back, even if Joe Biden's elected. The relationship we had in the past is dead. We should acknowledge that, and we should talk about how we reinvent a partnership for the future. The second mistake, I think, will be on Inauguration Day if Joe Biden is elected, and that is to simply be stupefied that his main priority will not be Europe or other parts of the world. It'll be problems at home. The administration will have to deal with an immense conflation of crises that the United States is facing right now. I call it the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. It's so bad. It is the pandemic, which is still out of control. We're still in the first wave of the pandemic. Europe is into a second wave. We haven't gotten out of the first one. There is an economic depression that has come because of that. There is the legacy of the Trump time in office. And then we have a huge social reckoning going on in this country about systemic racism and all the issues that have been associated with that over many, many, many years, and it's all coming to a head. So if a new administration cannot get that fixed, it's not going to be much of a partner for other countries. America will not be able to help others if it can't help itself. And a Biden administration will have to tend to those issues. But I think the immediate reaction I can see from European media will be the Americans are still isolationist. They're really, it doesn't matter Trump or Biden. I think that'll be wrong, because the task will be to reinvent the relationship for the future. Joe Biden has said Europe, the EU, is the partner of first resort. That's his quote, first resort. That means we would turn to Europe first to try to deal with any set of challenges. It's been an instinctive turn to our closest partners. You would see on day one a return to the Paris Climate Accord. You would see on day one a return to the Iran deal, but to press Europeans to press the Iranians not only on the nuclear part, but Iranian other activities, such as support for terrorism, support for destabilizing its neighbors, its non-recognition still of the State of Israel. It'll be a tougher demand also for Europe to rejoin that discussion. And then I think the ultimate upshot is this will be an administration that will expect more from Europe, not less. So going back to business won't be what it will be. It'll be asking Europeans, what are you prepared to do with a partnership that could be more equal and more global? And I'm not sure, frankly, our European colleagues are going to be ready for that type of America. So let me leave it there just to provoke and see where we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. That was, I would say, a very realistic point of view, even though you said there would be a difference when Trump would win or if Biden would win. But nevertheless, even if Biden would win, that would not mean that we would go back to business as usual. We would need to identify the partnership, the transatlantic partnership in a new framework and reshape it. Let me now go to our next speaker, EVA NOWOTNY. My warmest welcome. It's an honor to have you here. EVA NOWOTNY is chair of the board of the University of Vienna, and she's also the former Austrian Ambassador to the United States, France, and the UK. So she has a wide experience also living in the country there. Maybe a little bit on the same questions. If you look at the developments, the recent developments in the transatlantic relations, I mean, what is your opinion? What happened to this common understanding of the so-called values, as we called it, on the values we shared since World War II? And we cannot forget that also, I mean, the United States was very, very important for Europe when it comes to Marshall Plan, about rebuilding Europe and make it prosperous again. And what do you think? What do the US still mean for Europe? I mean, we heard now the different point of view, like what Europe means for the US, but what does the US mean for Europe? And maybe you can also elaborate a little bit on from your personal work, I mean, about diplomacy, about this whole issue of confidence building and trust. Is this still important in international relations? EVA NOWOTNY, the floor is yours.
And good morning, good afternoon to the colleagues here. Before I answer your question, Stephanie, I wanted to say I think it was a very good idea of Professor Hamilton to tell us a little bit about the intricacies of the American electoral process, because very few people here understand, used as we are to a much more direct way of voting and a much more immediate way of voting. The intricacies of this system was the role of the states and the role of the Electoral College. So I think that was a very good introduction. And I also think that what Professor Hamilton described, the connection between the foreign policy issues that will confront either the old administration or a new administration, and tie it into the domestic situation with the enormous problems that have accumulated in the United States and which are barely recognized outside of the country, but which are there, infrastructure problem, economic problems, and so. So they all feed, of course, into foreign policy decision making. In answer to your question, and you have touched a little bit upon the historic experience, we should not forget that the United States has consistently encouraged, especially in the earlier years, the European integration process. They were a motor and the driving engine of this process and have always supported it. The transatlantic relationship is a very important part of that relationship for a variety of reasons, not only because it's such an enormous economic importance here as well as in the United States, when you look at foreign direct investment, on the jobs that are depending on the transatlantic economy, the huge trading potential that exists here between the US and Europe. I mean, this is a powerhouse of economic relations. And then you have the other issues that you have touched upon. I mean, values questions, human relations, cultural relations, up to the important cooperation between the United States and Europe on global issues and the way we try to define global governance and try to maintain some kind of global governance. In the relationship, there always have been ups and downs, and it was never sort of a straightforward and a clear-cut road. I remember the times when we had Euroscepticism and Euro-pessimism, and then the United States was convinced that the euro would fail and that a European constitution would be dangerous for the United States and so forth. So there were always these issues. And I remember when I was posted to Washington, we were confronted with a very clear-cut US policy of causing division in the European Union over the Iraq War, where it was a declared policy that sort of they would split Europe, so what they called then Old Europe and New Europe, where countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary were the New Europe, and the rest of us who were critical of the Iraq War were branded old Europe and old-fashioned Europe. But nevertheless, we have always in a way struggled along. And I really would like to say that under the Trump administration, our relations have reached such a difficult point, more difficult than at any other point in our recent history. And there is something that also the United States should consider. If, by a recent opinion poll, in a country that is such a close ally like the United Kingdom, appreciation of the United States or approval of the United States has dropped around 40%. With in countries like Germany and France even lower. I mean, this is something that should also cause some rethinking in the United States. There are reasons for that, and there are reasons of a different kind. We have real policy agreements, and we have ideological rifts. We have policy disagreements. For instance, on the role of multilateral diplomacy, the role of international organizations, the role of diplomacy and negotiation and so on. But we have also ideological questions that go very deep in sort of core questions of the European integration, where the United States sees the world composed of foreign policy composed of an interaction between nation states. Yeah, and that's of course a direct attack on what we are trying to do in the European Union. We have several political issues, like for instance, for Europe, it has always been very difficult to accept the imposition of unilateral sanctions, extraterritorial sanctions. And we see that as a clear violation of international law, and have no understanding for that. We have difficulties with Middle East policies. We have been very critical of the unilateral decision of the United States to, with recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, plus the transfer of the embassy. And we also see in a way, the lack of a common global agenda at the moment between the United States and Europe. We have no longer an interaction on the global level where we follow together a common plan. If you look at the future and what might come sort of with the new administration, well, if we get a continuation of the Trump administration and President Trump really gets a second term, I agree with what Professor Hamilton has said. It would be a continuation of what we had now the last 4 years, plus probably a bit reinforced through the vote of the second term. And the division and the divisive relations will continue. If we get a President Biden, we know very little about what President Biden is thinking in foreign policy terms. Foreign policy issues have played almost no part in the electoral campaign so far. And you can only judge or guess based on his performance as a vice president in the previous administration. And there I see some encouraging signs, even though some of it might be difficult, as Professor Hamilton has indicated. But as a vice president, Biden has once said that Europe and the relations to Europe are the cornerstones of the American interaction with the world. And that's a very encouraging statement if you analyze that, because that shows that he values the relationship to Europe and is ready to prepared to build on that. He will also, I think, change the American position on multilateralism. And there are very few, a number of people who are close to President Biden and have been close to his campaign, who are working very much on diplomacy, on strengthening the international organizations, on strengthening international relations as such. And they will probably come into positions in the foreign policy context when if President Biden should be elected. A lot, of course, how this relationship will develop will depend on Europe. And of course, the danger is there, as Dan Hamilton has pointed out, that some countries will rush to Washington and try to cook their own steak, so to say. It's one of the big issues for the European Union, whether we will be able to develop a more coherent and a more cohesive foreign policy process, and based also on issues. it's we have seen in the past that this is not always the case, and that in many instances the European Union has played like a chamber orchestra with solo instruments, and that's especially if you think of the global issues that we are confronting in the relationship to Russia, in the relationship to China, in the relationship to Africa and to the whole turmoil in the Middle East. We would need a more cohesive approach, and we need, of course, also a closer relationship to the United States in order to be effective and effectual. I'll leave it at that at the moment, and we'll see how the development goes.
Thank you very much, Eva. I think you also tackled many important issues, especially also that we do not really know what Biden's foreign policy will look like. And this is probably also in line with what Mr. Hamilton said, that in the beginning, foreign policy might not play a big role, but there are so many domestic problems with which the US is occupying itself right now, with the pandemic, the economic pressure, the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. I would now like to go to Hannes SWOBODA. He's the president of the International Institute for Peace. He served as an MEP for 18 years in the Brussels, and he was also chairing the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Welcome, Hannes, and it was already touched upon the manifold issues when it comes to the European Union, the coherence within that we do not really have this strong and common global foreign policy because we are so divided within. And we also remember when Merkel was saying already in 2017 that we probably cannot count on our allies unconditionally anymore. And then later on with the new commission with von der Leyen, we remember it is no coincidence that she said she wants the European Union to be more geopolitical. And this is also, of course, in line with the transatlantic relations, which are a little bit downsliding for the moment. What do you think? What could the European Union do in order either to strengthen the transatlantic relations? Do we need to be more autonomous? I mean, maybe buzzword, strategic autonomy. I mean, what would you say? What is the future of the European Union? Looking also what is going around in its neighborhood. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, and welcome to the colleagues and to the 95 participants. Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot disagree very much with Dan, what he said. His outlook is not very bright. It could be gloomy, or it is a chance for the European Union. In general, I would say more or less it's a return of the United States' attention to the Pacific. That was more or less in the beginning of the foundation of the United States. If you look into the transatlantic relations, the good transatlantic relations, the importance of it, it more or less started with the Second World War, briefly with the First World War, when the US was engaged. Then it became more or less disengaged again, against the will of President Wilson. And then we had the Second World War. And we, most of us, many of us, not you, Stephanie, you're too young, but we grew up in a time when transatlantic relations was for us, also in Europe, if we were neutral or in NATO, it was the most important relationship. And for many Americans who had European ancestors and were now engaged in Europe as soldiers in Europe, that's over. That's not now existing. And of course, with the Pacific, there comes China growing, the military threat for the dominance of the US and the economic competition and threat. So I think we have to reorient ourselves into a new world. That's true. Of course, Trump makes it very extreme, but he is an extreme expression of what happens as a general trend and tendency. Now, we Europeans, of course, we thought, okay, Trump is here, what can we do? But anyway, he's so crazy, in 4 years' time it will be over. And then, as Dan said, many of us thought, okay, return to business as usual. It will not come. It will not come with Trump anyway, but it will also not come with Biden. Also, of course, there are some differences. If you look to the political field, political security field, Russia for the US is not the big threat. Of course, military, they have to do something on disarmament, or they should do something from the European perspective, but then the two do it. Maybe they invite China, if China would come, is another issue. So the attention is back from, is away. Russia was the big link, so to say, between US and Europe. If there's an enemy there, the main enemy is Russia, so we have to work together. If Russia is not the main enemy anymore, transatlantic relationship is not so important. All the rest of it, Turkey, for example, now we have Turkey, the conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean, maybe engagement of Turkey in Azerbaijan, so it is denied also by the president of Azerbaijan. The US is refraining from intervening in these fields. It's not their business. Europe should do it if we want to do something. Also on the Middle East question, Trump has his business. I think even with Biden, the Iran issue would be different. Of course, Biden would in principle like to return to the JCPOA agreement, but I think Dan mentioned it, Europe would have to put pressure on Iran concerning the intermingling in the affairs of Iraq and Lebanon and on the missile issue. So I think it could only be an enlarged agreement with Iran beyond the mere nuclear issue. Then one element, of course, which is very important, where the difference is the biggest one, is the climate policy. For Europe, as you saw, the declaration of von der Leyen, climate policy is an important issue. We could come to an agreement also with China, but of course with Biden we could also put much more pressure on China to really implement what Xi Jinping, the president, has promised, to be carbon neutral in 2060. So yes, the issue on climate change, I think, is the biggest issue and the biggest support for good transatlantic relations if Biden is elected. If, of course, Trump is elected, the issue is, again, we are alone. And we have to deal with China, which is under threat, economic threat from US, and where we also have, of course, our economic issues to regulate. So, yes, many of the issues in Africa, for example, there's a real withdrawal from Africa. Of course, Trump says, what should I do with the refugees from Africa? That's your business. And Biden will not be much more engaged. So all the issues we have now, we are even more let alone and with less American support. And I fully agree with what Dan said, that with Donald Trump, it will be a worsening of situation. We cannot say, well, another 4 years, forget it. So we just, keep quiet, because Trump will think that the support by his voters can be now transferred and transposed and transformed in more pressure on Europe. Two last remarks. Trump or Biden will be elected, but Merkel probably will disappear from the European scene. When there was one personality who had the ability to bring the people together, from Orban and partly even the Polish and the French and the Italian and whatever, it was Merkel. If we don't have any more Merkel as some sort of a spokesman for Europe, for European interest, it will be very, very different. I know one of the possible successors, Mr. Laschet, and a bit some of the others, but they have not the strengths, not the experience, not the possibility to speak for Europe in that sense. First, they have to speak for Germany, which is difficult enough for them if they are newcomers. So what Dan said, that people will rush to Moscow, to Washington, it depends on how, let's say, with Merkel it would be more difficult. Without Merkel, having a strong word in Europe, it will be much easier. And then the second and last remark is about Brexit. Now, Brexit will happen, and it very much depends if Mr. Johnson is able to find a deal with Trump, for example, on defense, on economic issues, and so on. Then both of them will say to European leaders, look, If you do it without the EU, you get a good deal. Now, I doubt that it will be so easy because Trump will demand some things, for example, on the privatization of the health system and so on, which is not easy to sell in Britain itself. And Eva rightly mentioned the skepticism even in Britain about the role of the United States. But I think when we speak about the effect of the United States on Europe, the effect depends very much on the severity of the effect. The catastrophic result depends very much on how Europe will react. But in any way, in addition, the worst situation would, of course, if Trump wins, Merkel leaves the political scene, and Johnson is able to have some deal with the US, then I see really, as we would say, black for Europe. Then I see a real danger for European unity. So unless Macron gets some more status, but I doubt that he will get it because he's too French and not European enough, which is a different domain. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Yeah, I think you made a good point also when you said that the most important and pressing topic will be the climate issue, and that is also one issue where we could try to work together, even with China, the US, and Europe. And of course, you also addressed the leadership question within the European Union once Merkel will disappear, and what Brexit does mean for the transatlantic relations in general. Before I go to the discussion, there are already questions coming in. I would like to give you very shortly, I don't know if you would like the floor to react to what the other people have been saying. Maybe Mr. Hamilton, if you want to add something, or do you think something was missed out or misunderstood, and please, yeah.
You want me to go now or wait for some questions?
Okay,
Should I
Eva?
speak now? Should I speak now or wait for some more questions?
No, you can already, it depends on if you would like to address something what the other panelists.
Well, let me just make a very brief. I think I don't know that it's true that nobody knows what a Biden presidency will do. Joe Biden has been on record as a candidate on almost every issue we've talked about, already saying what he would do. He's been in public office for almost a half a century, so no one should be surprised about what he says he'll do. He has said, as Eva said, that Europe is the cornerstone of our engagement. As I said, Europe is the first resort partner, and he'll do that. On climate change, for instance, he has said within 100 days of coming to office, he's going to host a global climate summit. He's on record as saying that. So next spring already, you would have a global climate summit hosted by the United States with goals he has pledged the United States to adhere to that are as ambitious, if not more, than the European Union. The question will be, can the US and the EU then decide, well, what does that mean if we both have those very ambitious goals? And what does it mean for the Paris series that continues, where the UK was supposed to host a climate summit next fall? I think we could accelerate the process by a US hosted climate summit next spring that raises the bar for everyone on climate goals, because you would now have the US adamantly supporting that, and then use the fall summit as a way to continue that with the British. So that also brings in the British in a way that's positive. That's the kind of thing that he's already said he will do. So it's not a question. I think on Russia, I have to disagree a bit, especially if Biden is elected. He has been very clear. It's probably not something Austrians want to hear, that Russia will pay a price for some of its more adventurous activities. And he has doubled down. You will see a much tougher Russia policy under a Biden administration than what Trump is doing. Russia, I think you can argue over the long term, is less of a world-class power, but in the short term, it's more desperate, the regime. And because of that, it can also be more dangerous, especially for its neighbors. And if you have an administration committed to our common security, it will double down on that commitment. It won't back away from it. So even there, I think, now And I think on China, the difference will be, while the Democrats are also tough on China, Vice President Biden has been very clear. He said our first turn will be to get our European partners with us on an approach to China, not to split the Europeans or beat them up. And, you know, I would use the these are all my personal views. I would just use the framework the EU itself has adopted for a China policy. Where do we agree, Europe and the United States, on China as a partner? And I think we can identify areas such as climate, for instance, anti-piracy, a number of areas where we need to work with China. Where do we want China or understand China to be a competitor? And there I think we also have close agreement, especially on many of its economic activities. And where do we think China is a systemic rival? These are the EU's words, not American words. And I think there we too would agree on about trying to erode certain norms of the international order, including multilateral norms that Eva has mentioned. And what do we do in all three of those baskets together? It's not an anti-China course, but it is a clearer course that we could set together. I think you would see a Biden administration do all of that. And the first priority, where you can link the domestic challenge with the foreign policy, is we need to come to terms on a general agreement on how to deal with the vaccines that are coming, distribution of vaccines, maybe a quick trade agreement to get rid of all tariffs on any medical equipment or anything related to that, and maybe a transatlantic recovery initiative that's economic in nature, where we can grow back together. Because as Eva said, we are deeply, deeply tied to each other economically. And I think a Biden administration would root its policy in that understanding. So I see a lot of potential there. My only point is that's going to demand Europeans to be ready on day one, to step up to those types of requests, if you want to put it that way, from their American partner.
Thank you very much. Eva, maybe you can also, if you would like to add something, but maybe you can already tackle then the first question, which asks about how will European powers balance out an even more dominating US administration if Trump gets reelected? But maybe you can cover the question, but also if you would like to reflect on what Mr. Hamilton has been saying, please. Unmute, please unmute.
Yeah, okay. You can hear me? Yeah, okay, fine. I just wanted to come in briefly with a few additional remarks in a similar vein to Dan Hamilton. Because what we know, and if we think back on the experience of Vice President Biden as part of the Obama administration, he has made very clear announcement already during his campaign that he is going to rejoin international treaties that Trump has abandoned, that he is going to rejoin, for instance, WHO, which the Trump administration has left, and that by doing that, the whole framework of sort of multilateral diplomacy, multilateral cooperation will get a new boost. I think that's a very important factor. The second thing is in relation to what Hannes SWOBODA has just said, I don't think that we should abandon President Macron so casually. I think Macron has a very clear vision of the European Union and what Europe should be in the world, and of course very much tied into French politics. But I think there is something that has to be taken very seriously, and a very serious European engagement. And in answer then to the question that came from one of our participants, I think if Biden is elected, what will change, and we should not ignore that atmosphere plays a very big part in diplomacy and in international relations, and that President Biden will no longer classify or define the European Union as an enemy, a foe, as a competitor, all these things that we have heard now during the last years, is going to make a huge atmospheric change, that we will be seen as partners in a common endeavor. How this is going to work out if President Trump should be elected, I have no clear answer, and I'm very doubtful that I think it will probably continue in the same vein that we have seen for the last 4 years. And a lot of the reaction will then depend, of course, on Europe and the European Union. I think one of the things that we will probably have to emphasize is that we do not only concentrate all our political involvement on Washington, that you work much more into the various states, that you work with governors, that you use public diplomacy tools, that you reinforce work with Congress, and not concentrate only and everything on the White House. Although, of course, in the American political system, the importance, the president is an extremely important factor in the foreign policy process.
Eva, thank you very much. Hannes, maybe you can also still reflect on what has been said before, but I would also already like to address a question to you. And this is also from one of the participants, and he says that Mr. Hamilton's response revolved in part around the idea that Europe is not working to prepare itself for whichever administration will take power in January. Can any of you panelists speak to what actions European allies are actively taking in preparation of either candidate winning?
Well, first of all, what Dan said in his second, intervention was much more optimistic than perhaps in the first. And I agree, basically, of course, Biden would make a lot of difference, also from the atmosphere, as Eva said. But on the other hand, of course, it depends on the general development. For example, China will be the big challenge. Now, I agree with them that it would be good to work together because we could be much more successful. And Europe, for me, also the European position is more realistic and more success promising. But of course, the details are important. For example, 5G. Will the United States continue to put pressure that 5G is not used or is on the limited use? So I think the general declaration by Biden, and I agree, of course, it's all his philosophy for many years, is here. But when it comes now to very concrete steps, it will be much more difficult. And all I wanted to say is what Dan said in his first intervention. There will be no business as usual. It's not a return to what was before Trump. It's a new, Trump created a new situation, new expectations, and we have to react to it. Are we able, as Stephanie, you know, to put the question from the participant, and are we prepared to do it? I doubt. Because Europe is very much, of course, now with COVID and all these issues, attention is anywhere else and not really in the election and the preparation of the election. Maybe some, circles in Brussels do that. But the problem again is what can be the common line of European Union? Because even in China, you have a different position. Now you have some countries who are going forward, having good relations, others more critically. But even in individual countries, look, for example, to the Czech Republic. The president is very much for it, but the president of the Czech parliament was now in Taiwan and is very critical about the situation. The president of Slovakia declined to speak at an event as long as Huawei is supporting the event, the Globsec discussions in Bratislava recently. So the split is going through the countries, and it's not easy for European Union to bring them together. Now, to the remark about Macron, I hope Macron can live up to the expectation, of course, and he has some good ideas. If you see his action, it's sometimes very, let's say, very specific. And as we saw in Lebanon, when Macron went there, he wanted a new government, and of course had talks with Hezbollah. And what did Trump? Trump said he put Hezbollah, some people from Hezbollah, on the terrorist list, and that was, of course, the whole idea of Macron was collapsing. So again, France has to take more European role and position if he wants to substitute Merkel and wants to bring Europe together, which would be very, very important, because Brexit is away. If now Britain is away, Brexit is implemented. If Merkel leaves Europe, it will be very hard. Anyway, I think on this point I agree with Dan that, of course, with Biden, it would be much easier to come into terms with the United States policies, of course, but it should not be, we should not think everything is done already. Biden is here, wonderful, and we can lean back and everything will be as it was before. Even before, as Eva mentioned, it was not always honeymoon.
Thank you very much. I will take now another question, which is directly also addressed to Mr. Hamilton. And Mr. Kraft asked, what you said about Poland and others rushing to Washington in case of a Trump victory to get security assurances from the US. How could Trump or the US provide credible assurances to the Poles outside of NATO? And let me probably also add another question from Patrick McGrath. Hello, Patrick. Can you discuss what you think the likelihood of a disputed election result would be, and if so, what might happen? So one question about the security assurances for the Polish, but then about disputing election, what could be the result of it?
Well, there are any number of mechanisms the United States could take to secure bilateral security partnerships within Europe. The Poles, frankly, have been pressing for that for the last number of years because they frankly don't trust their European neighbors to come to their defense, especially Germany, if I may be so blunt, to Heinrich, who's an old friend, I should say. And so, the U.S. has bilateral security arrangements with all sorts of countries on the world. It just has preferred to do it within Europe through NATO rather than independently because it has found that's been the most effective way to do it. And one always has to remember, one purpose of NATO was not about, I'm always troubled when people equate NATO with Russia. That was one purpose of NATO was to deter Russia. But if you remember its origins, it was also to give Europeans the security confidence after 2 world wars that they could build their security together rather than look over their shoulder at each other and wonder what their neighbor was doing. The confidence that NATO provided, frankly, was the umbrella under which the European Union was built, because countries had finally the confidence that they could start to merge their industries and their economies and start to build this new Europe, because that security concern had been taken by the United States. The US has for decades played this role of the reassuring power, reassuring Europeans about each other, not just about what to do about Russia. And the danger now with Trump is that the US has turned from a source of reassurance to a source of anxiety within Europe. And the likelihood of the US not only being a source of anxiety, but then acting to actively break up the EU, which Eva has sort of referred to under Trump, he calls the EU a foe, is high. And I'm not sure Europeans are ready for this. I could easily imagine the United States and Poland striking a bilateral security guarantee, even if NATO exists. And I could see the US doing that with the UK, for instance, and a number of other countries probably. And the fact is, they will all rush to Washington to try to be first in line for that type of arrangement. And that will be the end of European unity And that'll be the beginning of a new race within Europe of insecurity, with even EU member states looking over their shoulder at each other. That's not the Europe we want. But it's the America you might get if Donald Trump is reelected. I'm sorry to be so blunt on that. On the US elections, there have been a number of times in US history where the election is not clearly decided on election day. So it's not necessarily new. If any of you are old enough to remember Al Gore versus George W. Bush, it went on for another month, and it was finally decided in the Supreme Court of the United States. That was a case where the debate was about one state. It was about the vote counts in Florida, one state, because of our electoral college. It could be the situation is that there are disputes in many states this time, because it's very unclear with the mail-in balloting, suppression efforts. Donald Trump is calling for militias basically to go watch the polling places. It's a very strange time. So if you have contention in a number of states, and the mail-in ballots mean that some votes may not fully be counted by the end of election day. So one should be prepared that one scenario is that you have to let the election mail-in ballots simply be counted. That runs, I think the latest state that will allow the counting is until about the 13th of November. So about 2 weeks later, before we would know if it all depends, I think it's Michigan, on Michigan. The other is that, like Al Gore versus George Bush, there could be a legal case that would have to continue and could go to the Supreme Court. If those legal cases continue and no decision is made, by January 6th, regardless, the House of Representatives makes the decision. Just so we're clear. There is actually a process in place to make a decision, and it's in the House of Representatives of the Congress, which is also up for re-election. And so that is, I don't want to go into the details, it's a vote of the House by state delegation, not by individual members. So the Democrats are making the case, vote Democrat all down the line, because that could actually be what decides the US presidential election, not election day. I don't want to scare our European friends, but if you ask for these strange scenarios, those are the things that could play out.
There is another question directed to you, Mr. Hamilton, and someone asks how does a potential Biden administration make sure that it implements policies that are difficult to overturn for a possible Republican administration later? Like, for example, climate change policy, for example, this could be investment in renewable energy, which will be hard to reverse once done. How could this be approached for other important areas like social justice and economic depression?
Well, one of Joe Biden's strengths is he has been known to work across, as they say, across the aisle, bipartisan. When he was the vice president, President Obama turned to him to strike the deals with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the Republicans, because he has worked with the Senate and Republicans. So that is his strength. If he has a strength, that is it. He is able to pull together people from different persuasions. So that'll be his test. Can he do it in a way that, as the question said, sustainable? What President Obama did was he got out of sheer frustration, he started to issue executive orders. So the president just issues an order that something is changing on energy issues, for instance, climate. And because they weren't enshrined in law but with the Congress, the next president simply reversed them. That's what the question implies, that even after Biden, a new president could just reverse things. So one needs to avoid the temptation to just sign executive orders thinking I'm the president, I can do what I want. That's what Trump has done. Unfortunately, that's what Obama did too. Obama, despite, we might not remember, for the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, Barack Obama had a majority in both the House and the Senate. He had a complete Democratic majority. And he failed, if I may say, to get anything done. because he didn't have the capacity to work with others on his agenda. In Europe, he's celebrated, but he didn't accomplish what he could have in those 2 years. And that is the critical time in the US system, because we have 2 years later congressional elections again. So Joe Biden will have a 2-year window to show he can enshrine some of these things. One needs to understand in our system, a treaty of the kind European countries are used to is very, very hard just because of our Constitution. You have to have a 2/3 majority of the US Senate, 2/3 agree, not a majority. And that's been very hard. On the other hand, you see in many, many areas, like the law of the sea, for instance, the US has not ever signed that treaty, but it adheres to it. And so there are lots of areas where other types of agreements have substituted for a treaty-based system. I realize that's not what Europeans want, but our system provides for other ways to do it. So I believe there will be ways to arrange that, but the test will be, can you convince enough Republicans to go along with your agenda so that it is politically sustainable?
Thank you. Yes, Eva, please.
I just wanted to come in briefly, Stephanie, thank you very much, to comment on what Dan has just said. Of course, the danger that the European Union fails to be cohesive and so on is there. What we have seen in the most recent past is not very encouraging in that respect. And of course, the temptation for some of our member countries to go over, make their pilgrimage to Washington in order to work out some separate deals for themselves is there. On the other side, and we should not ignore that, I mean, the European Union, for instance, in the Brexit negotiation has managed very well to maintain cohesion of its members, although the lures from the United Kingdom were there, and also for individual countries' big economic interests. Nevertheless, in all the difficult negotiation, it was possible to maintain a cohesive position of the European Union, and to sort of bring the negotiations on that basis. The second comment I wanted to make is to the possible outcome of a disputed election. And I mean, Dan Hamilton has been a little bit gloomy on the European prospect, but there is also perhaps we have to shed a little bit of gloom on that as well, because we have seen, first of all, a tendency to violence. We have seen that there are about 180 different militia groups who are highly motivated, armed to the teeth, and I would not exclude it at all that sort of in a disputed election, people sort of take the law into their own hands and react to what is happening on the political level on the street. And that would make for a very, very difficult situation, also in relationship to the transatlantic relations and to the attitude that the European Union has to take on the outcome of the election.
Thank you, Eva. We're already a little bit over time, but I think we can still take one or two more questions. And one is from Heinz Gärtner, and I would address that to Hannes. And the question is, what should Europe do if it comes to a military conflict between the US and China? Should it stay neutral, or will it be entangled in a great power conflict, or at least some countries?
Well, in general, I think, Heinz, that the issue of the competition and the issue of China will dominate in the coming years, because even with Biden, and Biden made it very clear that he wants to be very tough on China, he said himself, he will have to do it. Of course, as I think Dan mentioned, it would be much more successful if we can do it together in a more reasonable way, according also to the lines the European Union tried to define since some time, which is a give and take. But for the US, of course, it's also a military question, the question of the military dominance and security and the security situation in the South China Sea. China is aggressive there, yes, because it tries to get some of the islands which are at least contested. And there was a decision by an international sea court that China's aspirations are not founded in law. Of course, there are other interpretations. Now, I think what Europe anyway is to do together with others is to make it very clear that any kind of military conflict cannot be part of European interest, and we cannot engage in a military conflict. I think that is absolutely clear, and it would be absolutely crazy in any way to send even troops there. For the moment, I don't think, I think it is highly improbable, but of course some incidents can start a military conflict, but in any way, Europe should refrain from any kind of military engagement there. That's absolutely crazy.
Thank you. I have another question, and I think everyone has an opinion on that as well. And we just talked about China, so let's talk about Russia. And the question is, Russia is still a toxic topic in the US. Punishing Russia is a bipartisan ambition. How would Biden's Russia policy look like? I guess the question is for Dan Hamilton on Russia.
Well, again, this is my personal view. I'm not speaking for anyone, just so we're clear. I think there are three things probably that one should look to. One is to shore up the NATO alliance and to reassure allies that the U.S. commitment to NATO actually still exists. And then to follow through on NATO's own agenda, which is to strengthen deterrence and defense particularly for its eastern flank. That's not just the Baltics and Poland, but also Black Sea countries, Romania, and so on. I think there is a question of what to do in the south, where Russia is also active in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And I think you would see U.S. interest, not just with NATO, but working with the EU to think about how to deal with that issue. So Russia, in the traditional sense. I think the second is to look at the in-between countries of Central and Eastern Europe. These countries do not know where their future lies. We have not done a very good job in helping them understand that. They are held back not only by Russian designs, but by cronyism, corruption, other things, endemic to their own systems. But I think if we're honest with each other, we have both taken our eyes off the ball for that big space of Europe. It's no longer a priority. The United States, as Aoife said, had drifted away from considering that priority. People don't know why Ukraine matters necessarily. I think in the EU, so conflicted by its own internal problems, it's not prepared really to reach out to its neighborhood as it had before. I think the Biden administration would reassert that Central Europe really is still a strategic issue for all of Europe, because if you can't get it right there, Europe will remain unstable. And that's not in U.S. interest, not to speak of EU interest. But the third, I think, is to think of how we enable Russian bad behavior through our own activities. Money laundering, flows of corruption, all the things that go through Western institutions are our laws. And yet we enable it, we allow it, we look the other way. There's a joke about why Mr. Putin tried to poison the fellows and his daughter in London so brazenly, because the answer was because he thinks he owns London. Because London becomes the center of all of these flows of money. It's called the London Laundromat. And London's not the only capital in Europe where that's happening, if we're honest. And I think what you have seen, if you're paying attention to the Biden campaign, they are identifying, what we would call weaponized corruption as a big target. of a new administration. You know, I would hope that we would do that together. It's not just about Russia, it's about a phenomenon that we're all now grappling with. It's undermining structures of our own democracies. And that's a new agenda, if you will, that we have to take more seriously.
Thank you very much. Hannes or Eva, do you want to add something on the Russia question?
Very briefly, I think I doubt that Biden will have time to do much about Russia. Of course, if Dan is right, at the beginning you said that there is so much domestic issues to tackle with, and I agree. And then you have China and other issues. So I doubt there will be too much. Of course, some activities, yes. In any way, what should we do in Ukraine? What should we do even in Azerbaijan and Armenia? Russia will have to have a role there to play. Otherwise, the war will go on. There will be a conflict between Turkey and Russia. That is a possibility. Then it's a question how the NATO, for example, because Turkey still is a NATO country. Also, it is annoying many NATO partners. What will NATO and the US do? So I think, and in Libya, for example, even some European countries like France was more on the side of Mr. Haftar, like Russia. I think the situation is so complicated that I think that this kind of clear lines, which now are promised in a campaign, will be very difficult to be transformed into an active policy. But let's hope, and I think, of course, the cooperation between US and Europe with Mr. Biden will be much better, and we could do much more to stop Russian expansionism. But I'm a bit skeptical that there will be enough leverage and enough time to really be an important part of the US policy.
Thank you very much. Eva, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add a brief remark. I mean, for Europe, the relationship to Russia has, of course, a completely different dimension than for the United States. I mean, this is, after all, a neighbor. Yeah, geography is something that you cannot escape. We have economic relations that are important. We have energy relations that are important. We have cultural ties and historical ties with Russia that are important. Nevertheless, today the European Council has decided a very modest reaction by imposing limited sanctions on Russia as a retaliation for what has happened in the recent past, particularly in the Navalny case. As I said, a very modest reaction, but it shows a little bit the difficulty that we in Europe have when we discuss the relationship with Russia. Now, Dan has said that we are, in a way, encouraging or facilitating bad behavior on the side of the Russians. But we must also, I think, be honest and acknowledge that in some respects, we have also failed Russia, because we would have had a chance for a completely different relationship to Russia, building it up in the early 90s and when all these changes in Europe occurred. And that was an opportunity that was there, a window of opportunity which was not used in a constructive manner. And we left we left Russia on the fringes and sort of in its own fate. And that was a politically very bad mistake. And of course, today, when you look at what's happening in Russia and the way they are going, we pay a price for it.
Thank you, Eva. Maybe just a very last question. I mean, there are many more questions. I'm very sorry we cannot tackle all of those questions due to time limits. But there is a question I would say everyone could ask in a short sentence, maybe, and then we can also close the discussion. It was a pleasure, but the question still is, if American power depends in part on the attractiveness of the US as a model of various kinds, has the Trump experience done irreparable damage to the US international position? The question goes to everyone, and maybe we can start with Hannes.
I think no. As I said, we have to see the structural effects. We are too much thinking on individual personalities. individual personalities, of course, have an influence, and Mr. Trump, with his way, has a very strong influence. But I think there are structural changes we have to recognize, and these are changes, as I said, from the orientation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which does not exclude that, of course, in future also there will be specific interventions in the Middle East and in other areas. But I think if you look at history, individual president as Mr. Trump cannot change the course of history for a long time. He can annoy it, he can spoil some situation, but I think the US stays a very, very important power anyway.
Eva, what do you say? Please unmute. You need to unmute.
Yeah? Okay, fine. I would like to say that, first of all, in international relations and in foreign policy, nothing is clad in stone. Yeah, and everything that has happened can be repaired, can be changed, and so on. And we have seen that. I mean, who would have thought that that all the changes that have occurred in Europe in the last 70 years, if you had asked somebody in the year 1945, would have thought probably that's unthinkable. Nevertheless, it happened. So there is a lot of things that can be repaired. What encourages me to think is that President Biden, if elected president, will bring in a lot of very competent people that have now been sidelined. And I think this is something which encourages us to think that that things might turn also for the better.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. The last word. What do you think about the legacy then of the Trump experience in international politics?
Well, if he's reelected, then I think I think Europeans, when they saw we elected him 4 years ago, they said, well, they made a strange choice, but we'll wait for 4 years. But I think if he's reelected, the European view would be the Americans have made a strategic decision to go a new way, and that will lead to a deep estrangement and divorce, probably. I think if Joe Biden is elected, what you'll see is a new sense of what it means to be an attractive power, if you will, a soft power that you just mentioned. We have a debate within the Democratic Party between, I would call the Wilsonians. These tend to be American liberal interventionists who think America's mission is to crusade for democracy, to bring democracy to other countries or to enshrine it elsewhere as much as you can. It's very active internationalist, but it's also can be interventionist. I think we've seen that strain of the party has been sort of humbled by all of what's happening. And there's a different strain among progressive Democrats that's called Jeffersonians. Barack Obama was a Jeffersonian. He said America's mission is not to go out and bring democracy to others. It is to perfect our democracy at home. And that if we can show that a multicultural society the size of a continent can get it right as a democracy, that will be our attraction. That will be our power. It'll be the power of our example, not the example of our power. Bill Clinton had said that as well. And I think you'll see Joe Biden side on he's not by impulse, he's by impulse a Wilsonian in his history. But I think in the current climate, he's becoming a Jeffersonian, and he understands the coalition he will have to lead is Jeffersonian. It's not isolationist. Again, I think back to my first point, I think European commentators will get this wrong. They will confuse the Jeffersonian impulse to take care of all the huge problems Americans have at home and to show that we can build this democracy again for isolationist approach to the world. It's not, but it will get mixed up. And so I would just say, watch this space. I think you will see a U.S. that's humble in its approach to democracy, not a crusader. Message for many Europeans, I think. who feel that sometimes they get dragged along on those crusades, but it'll be an America that is attentive to problems at home. And I would hope our European colleagues will understand, as I said at the beginning, if we can't help ourselves, we're not going to be able to help you. And some understanding for that sense of prioritization will probably be the main message one should take forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan Hamilton. Thank you very much, EVA NOWOTNY. Thank you very much, Hannes SWOBODA. It was an interesting discussion. It's a very broad topic. Of course, we cannot tackle all the issues. There are many more questions, some specifically also when it comes to domestic policies, what is going on, what will be the election results. But I think everyone agreed that whatever happens, whoever is going to win the election, it's not going to be back to the status quo ante. So we will need to redefine the partnership, and let's hope that it's going to be a partnership between the US and Europe. So that it is now for me. My apologies to all the questions we have not been able to answer. Our next event on the post-election day will be on 5th November here in Vienna. And then we will also have another discussion on 19th of November dealing with post-election USA in the world. So what is going to be like, this is then really going to be in a big foreign policy picture, whatever, if we already know something by then. And you can also check our website on iipvienna.com. So we will also record all the events and put them there. So thanks again for me, and have a good morning still, Mr. Hamilton, and good night and good evening, Eva and Hannes. So thank you very much for joining us tonight or tomorrow in the morning. Goodbye.
Thank you, Stephanie, for moderating it. Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.